I have something in my workshop that should not exist. It is wrapped in a piece of my dead wife's nightgown, locked in a toolbox behind my table saw, and in 12 years I have never shown it to another living person. It is a piece of braided cord, 8 inches long, woven from plant fibers that no botanist I have quietly consulted can identify. And twisted into that braid, held in place by the fibers themselves, is a smooth white quartz stone. Someone made it. Someone gave it to me. And that someone was not human. But that cord is not the most disturbing thing in the toolbox, not by a long way. The most disturbing thing is the plaster cast beside it, 19.5 inches long, 8 inches across, 5 toes. A footprint that belongs to nothing in any field guide ever published. And there are 3 of those casts in there. 3 separate prints, 3 separate years, locked in the dark with 2 notebooks full of measurements that I took with the same precision I used to maintain 140 kilometers of northern rail line. My name is Lucien Garneau. I am 78 years old. I live alone in Saint-Émilie-de-l'Énergie, 2 hours north of Montreal. And I am going to tell you something I have never said out loud. Not to my wife, not to my priest, not to my daughter, who calls every Sunday from Sherbrooke and asks if I am eating enough. Not to the men I worked beside on the railroad for 31 years. I told no one. Because the person I was protecting with my silence was the woman who slept beside me every night for 43 years. Colette. She died 3 years ago in her sleep. And when she left, the only reason I had to keep my mouth shut left with her. So here it is, 12 years of it, and I will tell you right now. What I found on my trapline was not just footprints and moved traps. By the end, it was building things, engineering structures, disassembling steel mechanisms and putting them back together with improvements I could not have conceived in 50 years of trapping. And one night in November, it looked me in the eye from 60 meters away, and what I saw in that look was not the flat stare of an animal. It was recognition. But I am getting ahead of myself. You need to understand who I am first, because what I am about to describe did not happen to a man who invents things. It happened to a man who measures. I worked for Canadian National Railway for 31 years, maintenance of way crew. We laid rail, replaced ties, kept the ballast graded and the drainage clear on the northern routes, Sanitaire, La Tuque, Jonquière, sometimes further toward Chibougamau, when there was track work that needed doing. Hard work in hard country. January, on a rail section north of La Tuque, the wind comes off the Laurentian Plateau like a wall of broken glass. You put your head down and you swing your spike maul because the ties will not replace themselves. You learn things working the railroad. You learn to read the ground beneath you. You learn what a rail bed looks like when something heavy has crossed it in the night. You learn that a thing out of place can kill you. A loose spike derails a freight train. A shifted tie buckles a rail. So you look, you measure, you write it down. You do not guess. Remember that, because I applied every one of those habits to what I found, and the evidence still did not make sense. My family has trapped in the bush north of the Laurentians for 3 generations. My grandfather Theodore built the first cabin along the Rivière Matawan in 1932, hauled the spruce logs himself, cut them with a crosscut saw, dragged the wood stove in on a toboggan through 3 feet of snow. My father Henri kept the trap line running after the war. Tradition more than livelihood by then. The fur prices had dropped. Most old trappers had taken jobs in the mines, but my father was stubborn the way Quebecois men of his generation were stubborn. The bush was his church. The trapline was his prayer. He took me up starting when I was 9, taught me to set snares for snowshoe hare, to read marten sign, the tiny tracks, the scat, the roots through the canopy, they follow the same way every season. To build a conibear set for beaver, find the slide, angle the trap. In the bush with a trap in his hands, my father became someone else, calm, precise, almost gentle. Those weeks were the realest of my life. No telephone, no road noise, just the bush and the river and the work of your hands. I kept the trapline alive the whole time I worked for CN. Every November, 2 weeks. Drive up, run the line, bring back what fur I could. It was never about money. Marten pelts might bring $20, $30. It was about keeping my hands in my grandfather's work, keeping something alive that passed from his hands to my father's, to mine. When I walked that line in November with my pack on my back and the cold biting through my wool jacket, I was not a railroad worker anymore. I was a garnot. I was doing what garnots do, and there is no amount of money that can replace what that feels like. Colette never came with me. She was a Laval girl. The bush made her uneasy. The dark of it, the size of it, the way it pressed in from every direction until there was nothing left but trees and silence and your own breathing. She would kiss me at the door and say, "Reviens-moi en un morceau." Come back to me in one piece. Then she would go back to the kitchen and turn on the radio, and the house would fill with music, and she would not worry. Or she would tell herself she was not worrying. Colette was good at telling herself things. I always came back in one piece. Until the November, I came back with something missing that she could not see. Something that had been replaced by a weight I would carry for 12 years without setting it down once. The trapline ran 22 kilometers through Crown Forest. Mixed boreal, black spruce, jack pine, balsam fir, white birch near the river where the soil held more moisture. The first 8 kilometers followed a logging road so old the ruts were grown over with alder and the culverts had rusted through. You could walk right past them and not know a truck had ever been there. After that, on foot. My grandfather's trail blazes, axe cuts in spruce trunks, the exposed wood darkened to the color of old bone, were still there if you knew where to feel for them with your fingertips, running your hand along the rough bark until you found the ridge where the axe had bitten 70 years before. The cabin sat on a ridge above a beaver meadow, 14 kilometers in. Log walls, tar paper roof, wood stove that my grandfather dragged in on a toboggan, no cell service, no power lines, no road noise. The nearest human being was at a seasonal hunting camp 12 kilometers south, and that camp sat empty 10 months of the year. In November, when the snow was fresh and the bush was locked in that deep, early winter silence, you could stand outside the cabin and hear nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a car, not a plane, not a human voice. Just spruce needles ticking against each other in the wind, and sometimes the crack of a tree contracting in the cold. November 2009. I was 61, 2 years from retirement. 6 conibear 120s for marten along a spruce ridge, 16 kilometers from the road. Standard sets. Cedar platform nailed to a tree at chest height. 14-gauge copper wire. Beaver meat for bait. Same knots, same placement. I could build them in the dark. Check the line after 4 days. First 3 sets, fine. One had a marten. Normal. The 4th set was not normal. The trap had been removed from the tree. Not sprung. Jaws open, trigger, cocked, removed. The wire had been unwound from the nail, not cut with pliers, not broken, unwound, loop by loop, and the trap had been reset on a different tree 3 meters away. My cedar platform had been replaced. On the new tree, someone had folded a piece of birch bark double and wedged it into a natural crevice in the spruce trunk. I pushed it, solid, pushed harder. It held. My nailed platforms work loose after a week of freeze-thaw. This bark platform was anchored by geometry, the fold and the crevice reinforcing each other. It was better than mine. I told myself a person did this, another trapper. I reset the trap, drove home, told Colette the trapping was good. That was the last time I could explain anything. November 2010. 3 of my 6 marten sets had been moved. All 3 with wire unwound, not cut. All 3 improved. 1 repositioned directly above a marten trail I had missed entirely. A subtle path through spruce needles I had walked past for decades without seeing. That set held 2 marten, 2 in 1 set. I had never seen that in 40 years. But the thing that changed everything was what I found when I got on my hands and knees. No boot prints, anywhere. What I found instead were impressions. Wide, smooth, no tread pattern, no lugs, just a broad, even depression in frozen mud, like a bare foot, 18 inches long, 7 inches across. I measured it, wrote it down, started a notebook, Hilroy brand, yellow cover, $1.49. Date, location, diagrams, measurements, photographs with a disposable camera. I was a railroad man. When something is out of place, you document it. You do not guess. You do not assume. You build a record. 9 modifications that second year across the full line. Not just marten sets. 2 beaver conibears moved to new dam sites. Heavy 330 traps. 3 pounds of steel each, repositioned and rewired at locations I had never scouted. Both new sites were better than my originals. Better water flow, better approach angles, better concealment. One of my hair snare sets had been completely rebuilt with a mechanism that I had to study for 20 minutes before I understood how it worked. Whoever did it had bent a live birch sapling, green wood, 1.5 inches thick at the base, into a spring pole and attached my snare wire with a hand-carved wooden toggle. A small peg of hardwood, smoothed and shaped, inserted through a loop of twisted bark fiber that held the sapling bent until the snare was triggered. I had never seen this mechanism in any trapping manual, any book, any conversation with any trapper in my life. I tested it, tripped the toggle with a stick. The sapling whipped upright so fast I barely tracked the motion. The snare closed instantly. The tension was perfect, tight enough to hold a hair, not so tight that the wire would cut through. Whoever built this understood not just the mechanics of a snare, but the animal it was meant to catch. I went to the library in Joliet that winter. Public computer, typed with 2 fingers. Large footprints, northern Quebec. Someone rebuilding traps. Bigfoot forums. Blurry photos of stumps. Men in gorilla suits. I cleared the browser history and drove home ashamed. But shame does not erase 18-inch footprints. And what I found the following November made the library search feel like the sanest thing I had ever done. 2011, the year something built a structure on my trap line. A conibear set moved to a creek crossing I had never scouted, 300 meters off my established line. The trap was not on a tree. It was mounted on a framework. 8 or 9 sticks woven together, braced against 2 rocks on either side of the creek. Cross members, diagonal supports. The trap sat at exactly the right height for a beaver swimming downstream. Water flowed through the frame without disturbing it. I stood in that creek with November water running over my boots, and I could not fill my lungs. Because this was engineering. Crude, yes, sticks and rocks and gravity, but engineered by something that understood what a beaver trap was for, that had watched me do it wrong and decided to show me the right way. I should have stopped there. Any rational person would have. Documented it, walked away, sold the trap line, and spent the rest of their winters watching hockey in Saint-Émilie like a normal retiree, but I could not stop. And what I found over the next 3 years is the reason I could not stop. Because whatever was out there was not just fixing my traps. It was learning, getting better, evolving its technique the way a craftsman evolves. Year by year, season by season, each iteration more refined than the last. And I had to see where it was going. Year 4, 2012. The modifications moved deeper. A beaver set at kilometer 18, 4 hours walk from the cabin, had been relocated to a dam site I did not know existed. I had to bushwhack through 200 meters of deadfall and alder swamp to reach it. A perfect active dam. Whoever moved my trap had scouted terrain I had never walked and found a better site than any I had chosen in 4 decades. That set caught 3 beaver in 2 weeks. That same year, I found the evidence that eliminated my last rational explanation. I had been telling myself the modifications might be the work of a skilled hermit, someone living off-grid in the deep bush, until I found a snare set where the spring pole was a green spruce sapling. Not birch, spruce. And spruce does not bend. It resists. It splinters. To bend a green spruce sapling past 90 degrees without cracking it requires sustained, enormous force applied slowly. I tried it myself. Same diameter. I put my full weight into it. The wood snapped at 60 degrees. Whatever bent the one on my trap line had bent it smoothly, continuously, with no tool marks on the bark. Just raw compression. No human being I have ever known could do that with their bare hands. That was the moment I stopped looking for a human explanation. And that was the moment the obsession truly took hold. Because once you accept that something impossible is real, you cannot look away. You can only look closer. Year 5. The wire work evolved beyond anything I could replicate. Tight coils replaced simple loops. Figure-8 patterns appeared. Techniques I had never seen in any manual, any trapper's work, any reference I could find. One set had the wire routed through a natural groove in the bark, so that force from a struggling animal would tighten the connection rather than loosen it. I stared at that set and felt something I did not expect. Humility. The design was better than anything I could have conceived. Year 6. Braiding. 3 strands of my 14-gauge copper wound in a tight helix. I grabbed it and pulled with everything I had. It did not move. My own wire work, single strand, simple loops, would have torn free in a second. This braid would have held a bear. And the plaster casts kept accumulating. Dental plaster, mixed to the consistency of pancake batter, poured fast. 3 casts over 3 consecutive seasons. The largest, 19.5 inches. 8 inches across at the ball. 5 toes. Weight distribution suggesting upright bipedal locomotion. Visible arch. Deep heel strike. These were not bear tracks warped by melt. They were exactly what they looked like. I wrapped each cast in a towel and locked it in the toolbox with the notebooks and the 73 photographs. Now I need to tell you what 6 years of this does to a person. Because from the outside, it sounds fascinating. A puzzle. An adventure. From the inside, it was a slow kind of torture. I had evidence of something impossible, and I could not tell a single human being. Colette would have been terrified. She would have begged me to stop going. My friends from the rail yard would have laughed me out of the Legion Hall. Père Tremblay would have given me that look priests reserve for parishioners losing their grip. My daughter would have called her mother, worried, and the two of them would have whispered about me in the kitchen. So I would come home. Notebooks full, cameras full, stone in my pocket heavier than it had ever been. Colette would ask how the trapping went. Papier. Not bad. She would set my supper on the table, her tourtière, her ragoût de boulette, her cretons on toast, and I would eat. And I would say nothing. She knew something was different. She could read me the way I read Martenstein, by small traces. Around 2013, she told me I seemed distracted, that I used to come home relaxed, and now I came home wound tight as a watch spring. I told her the bush was changing, logging getting closer. She accepted that. Because in 43 years, I had never lied to her about anything that mattered. I used her trust as a wall to hide behind. That is something I will carry until I die. By fall of 2015, I had 47 modifications documented, 2 full notebooks, 3 plaster casts, a theory tested with railroad precision. Whatever was out there was intelligent, watched me regularly, concentrated its activity in the deep old growth between kilometers 14 and 15, and was improving its skills over time. Learning, practicing, 47 modifications, 3 plaster casts, 6 years, and I had never seen it, not once. I decided to change that, and the way I did it was to offer it something it could not resist. I built an observation post. Posted observation, I wrote in the notebook. On the spruce ridge between kilometer 14 and 15, where modifications appeared fastest. Ground blind. Spruce boughs, 60 meters from my most frequently modified set. Binoculars, sleeping bag, dried food, no fire. And that morning, I set a fresh marten trap. Deliberately sloppy. Loose wire, bad angle, platform too low, held with a single nail that would work free in a week. I set it wrong on purpose. Because a badly set trap, to something that had spent 6 years perfecting my work, was an invitation it could not ignore. A misspelled word to a school teacher, a loose spike to a railroad man, something that had to be fixed. 3 days I waited, before dawn until after dark. Cold food from a bag, dried meat, dried fruit, hard bread I had baked the week before. No fire. The smoke would carry, -12 on the second night. My toes went numb by midnight and did not come back until morning. I urinated in a bottle to avoid leaving scent outside the blind. I barely shifted my weight. The sleeping bag kept my core warm, but my face was exposed to the air. And by the second morning, my cheeks were raw and cracked from the cold. 3 days of nothing. Nothing but spruce boughs and silence and a badly set trap that hung on its tree untouched. I watched that trap the way a hunter watches a salt lick. Hours of staring. The moonlight moved across the ridge in slow arcs. Owls called. Something small, a marten or a weasel, crossed the ridge on the second night, a dark shape flowing over the snow like water. But nothing came to my trap. Nothing touched it. Nothing changed. By the third evening, I was cracking. My back ached from 3 nights on frozen ground. My knees were swollen and stiff. I was 67 years old, sitting in a pile of spruce branches in November in northern Quebec, waiting for something I was beginning to think existed only in my notebooks, and my need to believe that the bush held more than what science had already cataloged. Maybe that was it. Maybe I was just a lonely old man who needed a mystery because without one, The trap line was just work, and the bush was just trees. And the 2 weeks in November were just the habit of a man whose world had gotten smaller every year since he retired from the railroad. The self-doubt was worse than the cold, worse than the loneliness. The voice in my head that said the footprints were bear tracks warped by freeze-thaw. That the rebuilt traps were the work of some hermit I had never met. That the engineering and the braiding and the toggle mechanisms all had explanations I was too stubborn or too invested to see. The voice that said, walk away, go home, watch hockey, grow old like a normal person. I almost listened. Almost. Then, at 2 a.m. on November 14th, 2015, I heard a sound that ended one version of my life and started another. A thick branch, being bent, not snapped, no crack, bent, slowly, with enormous controlled strength. The low creak of living wood flexed by something with the power and the patience to bend it gradually. The moon was nearly full. Silver light came through the canopy in pale columns. I could see the tree where my sloppy trap was set, 60 meters away, lit in one of those columns. Something was standing beside it. I want to be careful here. I want to be exact, because precision is all I have. It is the only thing that separates what I am telling you from a story someone made up around a campfire after too many beers. The figure was upright, standing on 2 legs, facing the tree where my trap was set. Its body was angled slightly away from me, a 3/4 view, the right shoulder closer, the left shoulder further. My trap platform was at 4.5 feet, chest height for me. The figure was working on it at what appeared to be navel or lower ribcage level, which put the figure at somewhere between 7.5 and 8 feet tall. I say somewhere between because I could not measure it. I could only compare it to the tree, and I knew the dimensions of that tree because I had nailed a platform to it that morning. Broad, not heavy, not fat. Broad the way a draft horse is broad, through the chest and the shoulders, a thickness that comes from structure, not excess. The torso tapered slightly at the waist, but not much. This was a body built for sustained power, for carrying, for lifting, for bending green spruce saplings past 90 degrees without breaking them. Its arms were long. They hung past the knees when the figure shifted its weight from one foot to the other. A small, unconscious movement, the kind you make when you have been standing in one place for a while. And the arms ended in hands. Through my binoculars, shaking badly, the image jumping with every heartbeat, I could see fingers, long fingers, 4 digits and a thumb. The thumb separated from the others, opposable, working independently. The fingers moved with a deliberateness I have never seen in any animal. Every motion had purpose. There was no fumbling, no hesitation, no trial and error. It was covered in dark hair, brown or black. Moonlight steals color, so I cannot say which with certainty. Dense, close to the body, like the thick autumn coat of a black bear, but covering a frame that was nothing like a bear's. The hair on the head was longer, thicker, hanging slightly over the brow ridge. The hair on the arms was shorter, sleeker, and it was unwinding my wire. Every motion deliberate, no wasted movement. It unwound the loose copper loop by loop with those long fingers, working the wire back on itself the same way I would, but faster, smoother, with a confidence that suggested it had done this hundreds of times. It pulled the trap free from the nail, held it in one hand, a 3-pound steel Conibear 120, held the way you would hold a coffee mug on a Sunday morning, as if the weight was irrelevant. It carried the trap 4 meters to a different tree. A tree, I would confirm the next morning, sat directly above a marten run I had walked past for 6 years without noticing. It mounted the trap, wound the wire in the braided pattern, 3 strands, tight helix, the same technique I had been finding on modified sets since year 6. It replaced my cedar platform with folded bark, wedged and braced. And then it did something that has stayed with me more vividly than anything else in the encounter. It tested the trigger. One long finger extended slowly. The fingertip touched the trigger plate and pressed. Gently. So gently. The way you press a piano key when you want the softest possible note. The way you touch something you have made to see if it is right. It pressed, and the trigger held, and the finger withdrew, and the creature stood still for a moment, just a moment, looking at the finished set, evaluating its own work. Then it turned its head and looked directly at me. No startle, no freeze. It looked at me the way you look at someone you have known was there all along. The way you glance at a neighbor's window when you know they are watching. Its face was broad, heavy-browed, eyes set deep under the ridge. They caught the moonlight, not the flat reflective flash of a deer or raccoon. These eyes were deep, and they held something I cannot say without sounding like a fool. Patience. Not curiosity, not threat. Patience. The kind that comes from watching someone for a very long time, from deciding years ago that this person was worth the attention. 5 seconds. Then it turned and walked into the spruce. Fluid, silent, each foot placed with precision on the frozen needle floor. 30 seconds, and the bush was empty. The moon still up, and the marten trap on that new tree was the most perfect set I had ever seen in 50 years. I did not move until dawn. 4 hours. Shaking. Heart slamming. Trying to rebuild my understanding of the world around a fact that fit nowhere. Morning light. I walked to the trap. Braided wire. Bark platform. Flawless. Tracks in the frost. 18.5 inches. 5 toes. It had walked to within 10 meters of my blind. The frost was melted where it had stood, watching me watch it. Then northwest into the old growth. I followed 200 meters before the tracks crossed a stream bed and vanished. I drove home. Colette was making tourtière. The kitchen smelled like pork and cloves. She smiled at me from the counter, relief and love and impatience all at once. The words pressed against my teeth. Colette, il y a quelque chose dans le bois, quelque chose qui n'est pas un animal et qui n'est pas un homme, et ça me regarde. There is something in the woods, something that is not an animal and not a man. And it looks at me. I swallowed them, kissed her cheek, said the trapping was good. That night, I locked my workshop door and stood over the plaster casts on the workbench. 19.5 inches. I held my own hand up, scars from 31 years of rail work, calluses from 50 years of trapping, the wedding ring Colette had put on my finger in a church in Joliet in 1975. And I thought about the hand I had watched through binoculars, the fingers that unwound my wire with more patience than I had ever applied to anything. 2 hands, 2 kinds, doing the same work, on the same trap line. I dreamed that night that we stood side by side at the marten set, and it reached over and adjusted my wire with one gentle correction, and in the dream I understood what I could not understand awake. It was not fixing my mistakes. It was teaching me, the way my father taught me, patient, without words, by doing. I woke at 4 in the morning with my face wet and Colette breathing softly beside me, and I thought about the oldest form of communication there is, not language, craft, showing someone how by doing it better. That is how knowledge moved through my family for 3 generations, hand to hand, trap to trap. And something out there had seen that, had understood it, had entered the conversation. Now, what happened in the years after the sighting was not a winding down. It was an escalation, because whatever had been hiding from me for 6 years had looked me in the eye and made a decision. The rules of engagement changed that night, and what followed was unlike anything in the first 6 years. The modifications continued through years 7 to 12, but they were no longer just corrections. They were experiments, innovations, things that went beyond improving my sets and into territory that I can only describe as invention. In 2016, I found a marten set where the creature had attached the bait not to the platform, but to a small branch suspended above the trap, so that the marten would have to stand on the trigger plate and reach upward to get the meat. It was a design I had never seen. It was brilliant. The marten had to commit its full weight to the trigger in order to feed. The kill was cleaner and faster than any of my standard sets produced. By 2017, the modifications had become so refined that I started photographing them not just as documentation, but as instruction. I was learning from them, applying what the creature had showed me to my other sets. My catch rate in the northern section of the line increased by nearly 40% over those years, because I was being taught by something that could not speak. Through the only language we shared, the work itself. By 2018, I found the set where the conibear had been partially disassembled. Trigger mechanism removed. A component reversed. A small steel arm that I had always installed one way, because that was how it came from the factory. The creature had reversed it. That reversal changed the trigger sensitivity. Lighter, more responsive. I had trapped for 50 years. I did not know it could be done, but it worked. Beautifully. I reversed that component on every conibear I owned after that, and every one of them performed better. And then the objects started appearing. Not modifications to traps, something new entirely. A smooth white quartz stone on the platform of a snare set. A raven skull on a flat rock near a beaver dam, facing the direction I always approached from. A piece of my own orange flagging tape tied in a complex knot around a branch near the blind. Not just moved, tied. In a knot I had not tied. It was communicating, through objects, through placement, through arrangement. When I started answering, smoked moose meat on a flat rock, copper wire beside modified sets, tobacco the way my father used to leave at the head of the line. The offerings were taken, every time, and something left in return. Meat for a fresh fish, whole and gleaming. Wire for a braided cord of unidentifiable plant fibers. The exchanges developed a grammar. Organic for organic. Manufactured for manufactured. I left a metal file once, found a flat stone with a natural scraping edge. The creature understood categories. It understood reciprocity. It was not just taking, it was matching. One exchange has never left me. In the fall of 2018, I left a photograph on the flat rock. A photograph of myself standing by the cabin, taken with a timer on a disposable camera. I do not know why. An impulse. Maybe I wanted it to see me the way I had seen it, still, fixed, captured. The photograph was gone the next morning. In its place was a piece of birch bark, about 6 inches square, One side scraped smooth, and pressed into that surface were two marks, two impressions side by side, one large, wide, deep, made by a broad fingertip, one smaller, my size, human-sized, two prints, together, on one piece of bark. I sat in the snow holding it, and I wept. Because I understood. It meant us, the two of us. A record of something that existed between us that I could not speak about to anyone alive. The glimpses continued, a shadow between spruce trunks at dusk, too tall, too upright, a silhouette on the ridgeline against the last light. Once, in 2019, breathing, 15 meters behind me, slow, deep, steady, the breathing of something large and calm and close. I did not turn around, finish my wire with shaking hands, walk to the cabin without looking back. At the door, my hands would not work the handle. Then the chainsaws came, and the world that had held us both began to disappear. Foresterie Mauricie, a Quebec forestry company based in Shawinigan. They had been awarded cut blocks that pushed right up against my family's land boundary, the line my grandfather had walked with a surveyor in 1935, and extended north into the Crown Forest, where the deepest, oldest, most untouched section of my trapline ran. The section between kilometer 15 and 22. The section where the modifications were most frequent. The section where the creature lived. I saw the orange survey ribbons first. Bright plastic tied to trees at chest height, every 20 meters, marking the boundary of the cut block. They looked like wounds, like someone had come through the bush and bled on every third tree. Then the blazes, fresh axe marks on the trunks, white and raw, the wood still weeping sap, marked for cutting. Trees that had been standing since before my grandfather was born, marked with a slash and a number, scheduled for removal. Then one September morning in 2017, I heard chainsaws. Distant, 5, maybe 6 kilometers north, but unmistakable. That sound carries through the boreal bush like nothing else. It cuts through the silence the way a blade cuts through cloth. It does not belong there. Every bird within a kilometer goes silent when it starts. The forest knows. I fought. I went to the municipal office in Saint-Michel-de-Saint and filed a formal complaint about the proximity of the cutting to my family's property. I wrote letters to the Ministère des Forêts, de la Faune et des Parcs. 3 letters, each more detailed than the last, each citing environmental regulations, watershed impacts, habitat disruption. I received form responses. Thank you for your concern. The cut blocks have been assessed. Sustainable forestry practices will be followed. I attended a public consultation meeting in a community hall that smelled like floor wax and coffee. A man in a clean shirt and polished shoes stood at the front and showed maps of the planned cut blocks, neat colored rectangles overlaid on topographic lines, as if cutting down a forest was a geometry problem. He talked about sustainable yield. He talked about reforestation timelines. He talked about 37 direct jobs and an estimated 200 indirect jobs in the regional economy. I sat in the back row with my hands clenched on my thighs, my knuckles white, and I wanted to stand up and tell the room what I knew. That something lives in those woods, something that can take apart a steel mechanism and put it back together with improvements, something that weaves rope from plant fibers and builds frameworks from sticks and trades gifts with an old trapper and presses its fingerprint beside his on a piece of bark. Something that has been there longer than any of us and knows that forest better than any forester with a clean shirt and a topographic map. I looked at the faces around me. Men I had known for decades. Men who had worked the mines until the mines closed. who had worked the mill until the mill downsized, who needed those logging jobs the way my father had needed the trapline. Not because they loved the work, but because the work was what kept their families fed and their houses warm. Women sitting beside their husbands, doing the math in their heads. You cannot protect something by destroying everyone around it. So I sat in my chair and I bit my tongue until I tasted copper. The logging pushed north through 2018 and 2019. Every season, the cut blocks crept closer to the core of the trapline. And every season, I watched the data in my notebook shift. Fewer modifications in the south. More concentrated deep north, past kilometer 15, where the old growth still stood. The trees my grandfather had walked under when he first blazed the line, the trees that had never heard a chainsaw. The center of activity was migrating, north and east, away from the diesel smoke and the road dust, into bush that had no name on any government map and no colored rectangle on any forester's survey. It was retreating, moving deeper, the way any intelligent creature retreats from a threat it cannot fight, not in panic, but in calculation, measuring the danger, finding the boundary, pulling back to where the world was still whole. And I was the only person alive who knew. I watched the pattern in my notebooks the way a doctor watches a patient's chart. The numbers going in one direction, the center of gravity shifting north. I could plot it on my cabin wall map with pins and string, and I did. 11 modification sites in 2016. 9 in 2017, clustered tighter. 7 in 2018, all past kilometer 16. The territory was shrinking, and I could not stop it. I could not even explain to anyone why it mattered. I left offerings further north, an extra 4 kilometers past my last set, into terrain where the spruce grew so tight you had to turn sideways to push through, where the moss under your boots was a foot deep and undisturbed by any human foot. The air was different there, older, heavier, like the bush itself was breathing slower. I would lay out smoked moose meat. I still smoked it myself, maple and alder chips, the way my father taught me, and copper wire and a pinch of tobacco. And I would talk, out loud, standing alone in the deep bush, talking to the trees. Told it about the logging. Told it the company had a 5-year plan. Told it I was sorry. Told it I had tried. The bush absorbed my words the way it absorbs everything, silently, completely, without judgment. Every time the offerings were taken. Every time something left in return. A stone, a feather, a twist of bark. We were still talking, even as the world between us was being cut down tree by tree. 2020 was the year the road came through. The company cut an access road right through the ridge where I had seen it. Right through the spot where, 5 years earlier, I had sat in a spruce blind and watched it test a trigger with one gentle finger. I walked that new road in September. The road was wide enough for a logging truck. Graded gravel over raw earth. Diesel stains on the ground, sawdust in the ditches, stumps on both sides, pale and raw, weeping sap. Trees that had been standing since before Confederation turned into stumps in an afternoon. I stopped in the middle of that road, and I cried. I am not a man who cries. I have broken bones on the rail line and kept working. Buried friends. Sat beside Colette's cold body for 3 hours without making a sound. But I cried on that logging road because I understood what was being erased. And I was the only living soul who understood. And the grief of that, the solitary, unshareable grief of watching something sacred be destroyed by people who could not know what they were destroying. broke me open in a way that nothing else in my 72 years had managed to do. That November, 2 modified sets, only 2, both deep north, past the new road, in bush so remote I camped overnight to reach them. Same quality, tight braiding, perfect placement, but 2, the year before, 11. Colette died in January of 2021. Aneurysm. She went to sleep beside me on a Tuesday and did not wake on Wednesday. I reached over to touch her shoulder. The same gesture, the same shoulder, every morning for 43 years. Her skin was cold. I lay beside her for 3 hours, held her hand. The furnace clicked on and off in the basement. The house was so quiet I could hear the clock in the kitchen, and I thought about her face. Peaceful, no pain, she had not known, had not had time to be afraid. But she had also not known the other thing, the biggest thing. 12 years of it, locked in a box 30 feet away in the workshop while she made my supper and asked how the trapping went. She had earned the truth, 43 years of trust and patience and love. And I had repaid her by hiding. I called the ambulance at 9. They came. They took her. My daughter stayed for 2 weeks. Then she went home. And it was just me. Me in the empty house. Me in the toolbox. The months after were the loneliest of my life. Lonelier than the bush. Lonelier than 3 nights in a spruce blind. Because in the bush, loneliness has texture, sounds, cold, the presence of living things. In a house your wife used to fill, loneliness is flat. It has no edges. You sit in a chair and the clock ticks, and you realize that the only being on earth who knew the shape of your real life was not your wife, not your daughter, not your priest. It was something standing in the dark between spruce trees 16 kilometers into the bush. And you cannot call it. You cannot visit it. You cannot even be sure it is still there. That is what silence costs. The chance to be fully known by the person who loves you most. And when that person is gone, the cost is permanent. That November, I walked the full line, 22 kilometers. Every set. Nothing. Not one modification. Not one wire unwound. For the first time in 12 years, my traps were exactly as I left them. I walked the line twice that week, checking and rechecking, bending down at every set to look for any sign. Shifted wire, moved stone, impression in mud. Nothing. The bush was the same bush. But the thing that made it extraordinary was gone. 2022. Set traps. Walked the line. Nothing. Left offerings on the flat rock at kilometer 16. Came back the next morning. The offerings were still there. Untouched. I stood over that rock for 20 minutes, staring at the smoked meat and the tobacco and the wire, and I understood what absence means. Not gone. Not dead. Just not here. Not for you. Not anymore. 2023, the same. Traps set. Line walked. Offerings left. Offerings stayed. The bush was silent in a way that felt like a door had closed. I began to accept it. The creature had retreated further north, into roadless wilderness where no trapline would reach and no logging company would cut. That was not defeat. That was survival. That was wisdom. But acceptance does not touch grief, and the emptiness in my chest did not care about wisdom. Then, on my last morning of the 2023 season, the very last day, walking out for the final time, I almost missed it. I was pulling my last marten set, the old Spruce Ridge, kilometer 14, the place where everything started. As I unwound my wire, a small object fell from behind the platform and landed on the frozen ground. It was not part of my set. It was not something I had placed. A piece of braided cord. 8 inches long, the same plant fiber material from the exchanges, tied in a simple loop, and woven into the braid, held by the fibers twisted around it, was a smooth white quartz stone. Round, perfect, the same type of stone that had appeared on my platform years before. The cord and the stone, together, made into one object, crafted, deliberately, by hands that could test trap triggers with a watchmaker's gentleness and braid copper wire into unbreakable helixes. A gift, left on the tree where it all began, where only I would find it, on my last day. It had been there, recently. It had been watching me walk the line one final time, and instead of showing itself, instead of stepping out of the spruce the way it had that November night in 2015, it had left this, quietly, in the space behind the platform where I would only find it when I pulled the set, a deliberate placement, a calculated timing. It knew this was my last set of the season. It knew I would find it here. It knew what finding it would mean. A quiet goodbye, in the only language we ever shared. The language of objects placed with care, of wire unwound and rewound, of things made by hand and left for the person you have been watching for 12 years. I held it in my palm, sat down in the snow. The spruce ridge was quiet around me. The sky was flat and gray and low, the way Quebec skies get in late November when the real cold is coming. I sat there and I held that piece of cord with its white stone woven in, and I thought about Colette's flannel nightgown in the bottom of the dresser drawer at home. And I knew what I would wrap it in. That cord is in my workshop right now, in the toolbox, wrapped in flannel that still smells faintly of the woman who wore it. Beside 2 Hilroy notebooks with yellow covers, their pages filled with my careful handwriting. Dates, measurements, diagrams, observations, 6 years on one side of a locked toolbox and 6 years on the other. 3 plaster casts, each one wrapped in a separate towel, each one a different year, the largest 19.5 inches from heel to toe. 73 photographs from disposable cameras, developed at the pharmacy in Joliet by a clerk who never looked at them closely enough to ask what those shapes in the snow were. And a piece of birch bark, 6 inches square, with 2 fingerprints pressed side by side, one large, one small, one from a hand that can bend spruce saplings, one from a hand that spent 31 years swinging a spike maul on the northern rail lines. 12 years of evidence that something lives in the boreal forest north of the Laurentians that can think, that can learn, that can watch a man work, understand his purpose, and do it better. That can disassemble a steel mechanism and rebuild it with improvements no human trapper ever imagined. That can weave cord and tie knots and build structures and arrange objects in meaningful patterns and invent new trap designs and reverse engineer factory components. That can trade gifts with a human being across a decade of patient, silent contact. That can press its fingerprint beside yours on a piece of bark and mean by it exactly what you think it means. I do not know what it was. I know what the internet calls it. I know the word that people type into search engines and argue about on forums and make television shows about. But the word is too small. It comes wrapped in blurry photographs and gorilla suits and night vision cameras and argument. And none of that, not one frame of it, has anything to do with what stood beside my Martin set in the moonlight and tested the trigger with one gentle finger, and then turned and looked at me with eyes that held 12 years of patient, accumulated attention. Eyes that knew me, that had watched me work and chosen to enter my world through the only door I had left open, the work itself. I am 78, healthy, thank God. My knees ache. I wear reading glasses. My hands tremble in the morning, but steady by noon. I could live another decade. And I will not spend it the way I spent the last 12, carrying the stone, lying by silence, alone with the biggest thing that ever happened to me. Every November, I still drive north. The truck knows the way. I do not trap anymore. The fur means nothing, and the tradition means nothing if the bush that sustained it has been hollowed out. But I walk to the flat rock at kilometer 16. The same rock my father laid his tobacco on. I leave smoked moose meat. I still smoke it myself, maple and alder, the old way. And a pinch of tobacco and a coil of copper wire. And every November, when I come back the next morning, the offerings are gone. And in their place is something small, a feather, a stone, a folded piece of bark, something placed with intention, with care, by hands I saw once in the moonlight and will see in my mind every day until I die. Something that says, in a language I learned across 12 years of unwound wire and rebuilt traps and patient midnight corrections, I am still here. I know you. I remember. I pick it up. I put it in my pocket beside the others. And I walk home through the bush my grandfather loved. Through the bush my father prayed in, carrying one more stone I no longer have to carry alone. Colette deserved better than my silence, and whatever is out there deserved better than being forgotten by the only person who saw it clearly. I have never told anyone this story. You are the first. Do with it what you will.